At my grandfather's funeral, his trembling fingers pressed a worn leather passbook into my palm just moments before he passed away. Before I could even process my grief, my mother snatched it from my hands and tossed it straight into the garbage bin. She hissed that it was old trash and told me to stop embarrassing our wealthy family in front of the elite guests. I did not shed a single tear. I just calmly retrieved the book from the trash and drove straight to the bank. When the manager scanned the barcode on the back, the blood completely drained from his face. He locked his office door and whispered that we needed to call the police and that I absolutely could not leave the room. My name is Valerie. I am 33 years old and work as a financial data analyst in Boston. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up in a sprawling suburban mansion in Massachusetts meant absolute privilege to outsiders. But inside our pristine walls, emotional manipulation was the daily currency. My mother Patricia cared only about country club memberships and appearances. My younger sister Brittany was her undisputed golden child. While Brittany received luxury cars and endless praise, I was treated like an inconvenient roommate. I paid for my own college with massive student loans while my family flaunted their wealth. I learned early on that silence and observation were my best survival tools. The air inside the Oakwood Memorial Funeral Home was thick with the suffocating scent of white lilies and expensive perfumes. My grandfather William had just taken his final breath in the adjoining private hospice wing earlier that morning, and now his casket lay in the center of the grand viewing room. He was the only person in our entire bloodline who had ever shown me an ounce of genuine kindness. While the rest of my family treated him like a burden, the moment his health began to decline, shipping him off to a care facility and claiming he was suffering from severe dementia, I was the one who visited him every single Sunday. I stood quietly near his casket, my fingers tightly gripping the small frayed leather passbook he had managed to slip into my pocket during my last visit just hours before he died. He had pulled me close, his eyes surprisingly clear and sharp, and whispered that the truth was waiting for me. I did not even have time to mourn properly. The sharp, rapid clicking of designer heels echoed on the marble floor behind me. My mother Patricia marched over. She was dressed in a custom black couture gown that looked more appropriate for a gala event than a funeral service. Her eyes darted around the room, making sure the local politicians and wealthy real estate developers she had invited were watching her play the role of the grieving daughter. When her gaze landed on my hands, her expression twisted into a mask of pure disgust. She lunged forward and snatched the old passbook right out of my grip. "What are you doing with this garbage, Valerie?" she hissed under her breath, her manicured nails digging into my wrist. "It is old and filthy. These pieces of trash should have been buried forever. Are you trying to humiliate this family in front of the entire country club elite with that junk?" Before I could respond, she tossed the passbook directly into a nearby brass trash receptacle. She smoothed down her dress and glared at me as if I was a stray dog that had wandered into her pristine living room. Right on cue, my younger sister Brittany strolled over, clinging to the arm of her husband Terrence. Terrence was a tall, imposing African-American man who worked as a high-end investment broker in the city. He was dripping in arrogance, wearing a perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit and a luxury watch that cost more than my entire annual salary. He had integrated himself into my family flawlessly because he shared my mother's exact obsession with money, unearned status, and absolute control. "Sister-in-law, please," Terrence sneered, flashing a perfectly white smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Grandpa lost his mind 5 years ago. That book probably has $5 in it from decades ago. I can write you a check right now to clear your student debt if you are that desperate for cash. Stop looking so pathetic and desperate. The local press is taking photos of our family today, and your depressing mood is completely ruining the elite aesthetic of the event." Brittany chimed in, adjusting her designer sunglasses and looking me up and down with absolute contempt. "Honestly, Valerie, you could have at least bought a decent dress for today. I know you are still paying off those heavy student loans because you insisted on being an independent data analyst instead of marrying well, but you look like a maid. Terrence just bought me a brand new Porsche last week for my birthday. Maybe I should have let you borrow my old sports car, so you would not look so utterly miserable and broke in front of our wealthy friends. My mother patted Terrence on the arm affectionately, completely ignoring my silent presence. Do not waste your breath on her, Terrence. Valerie always wants to play the victim to get attention. She turned her cold gaze back to me. Just clean up your grandfather's mess and get out of my sight, Valerie. Tomorrow morning, Terrence is officially taking over the rest of the logistics and managing the estate property, so do not do anything stupid to complicate his schedule. They turned their backs on me instantly, transforming their faces into masks of polite sorrow as they walked over to greet a state senator who had just arrived at the viewing room. They expected me to cry and beg for their inclusion. They expected me to shrink away in shame just like I did when I was an insecure teenager living under their roof. But at 33 years old, dealing with complex numbers, financial patterns, and hard facts every single day of my life, I no longer operated on emotion. I operated on data alone. And my grandfather's final lucid moments were hard data they were completely ignoring to their own peril. I did not argue with them. I did not make a scene to satisfy their need for drama. I simply walked over to the brass trash bin, reached my hand inside, and pulled out the worn leather passbook. I brushed off a stray piece of tissue paper, slipped the book securely into my coat pocket, and walked straight out the heavy oak doors of the funeral home without saying a single goodbye. I left them to their fake tears, their expensive champagne, and their delusions of grandeur. I got into my modest sedan and drove directly into the heart of downtown Boston, pulling up to the main branch of Bank of America. The lobby was quiet, sterile, and smelled faintly of polished floorboards and fresh ink. I walked straight up to the teller and presented the passbook, explaining calmly that my grandfather had just passed away and instructed me to bring this exact item here. The teller looked at the frayed cover, frowned slightly at its ancient appearance, and opened it. She typed a few account numbers into her computer system. Suddenly, she stopped typing. She typed the numbers again, leaning closer to her monitor. Her breathing hitched noticeably. She picked up her desk phone, dialed a quick extension with shaking fingers, and asked the branch manager to come to the front desk immediately. Richard Cole, a man in his 50s with a sharp, tailored suit and a highly serious demeanor, walked out of his glass office. He took the passbook from the teller, flipped to the very back page where a strange symbol was stamped, and scanned a faded barcode under his desktop scanner. The computer screen flashed a bright warning red. I watched in total silence as all the color completely drained from Mr. Cole's face. He looked at the glowing screen, then at the old leather book, and then slowly looked up at me. His hands were visibly shaking as he held the binding. "Miss, I need you to please step into my office right now," he said, his voice tight with a level of urgency I had never heard before from a financial professional. I followed him inside without a word. He shut the heavy glass door behind us and immediately locked the deadbolt. He reached over and closed the window blinds, plunging the room into deep shadows, isolating us from the rest of the bank. He reached for his desk phone with trembling fingers, looking at me with eyes wide with sheer, unfiltered panic. "Call the police right now," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of whatever terrifying truth he saw on that screen. "And you absolutely cannot leave this room until they get here." Richard Cole stood frozen behind his heavy mahogany desk. The glowing red warning on his computer screen painted a harsh glare across his terrified face. I watched his chest heave as he picked up the receiver again, his eyes darting frantically toward the frosted glass of his office walls. I asked him what was wrong. He held up a trembling hand, commanding my absolute silence. He explained that my grandfather's frayed passbook was not a standard savings account document. It was a high-security cryptographic ledger key. Scanning that specific faded barcode triggered an immediate silent alarm directly connected to federal authorities. There was exactly $0 in that account. The passbook was merely a physical authenticator for a subterranean safe deposit box that had been locked under a strict legal embargo for the last 5 years. Mr. Cole bypassed the local precinct entirely and contacted a direct federal line. He then gestured for me to follow him. We walked out of his office and stepped into the private elevator leading down to the underground vault. The air grew instantly colder, smelling of polished steel and recycled oxygen. He led me past rows of standard deposit boxes until we reached a secluded gated section at the very back of the facility. He inserted a master key while I handed him the old leather passbook. He placed it flat against a biometric scanner. The heavy metal door clicked open with a sharp mechanical thud. Inside the large steel box sat a thick stack of bank statements, medical records, and a black encrypted USB drive. On top of the pile was a handwritten letter addressed to me. I unfolded the crisp paper and recognized my grandfather William's precise handwriting immediately. The very first sentence made my blood run ice cold. He stated clearly that he never had dementia. He had faked his cognitive decline for half a decade to survive inside his own home and gather evidence without raising suspicion. I sifted through the bank statements, my eyes scanning the highlighted transactions. As a data analyst, the numbers spoke to me louder than words ever could. The truth behind Terrence's flashy lifestyle hit me like a physical blow. Terrence had manipulated a medical power of attorney to systematically drain $4.5 million from my grandfather's corporate retirement funds. That arrogant investment broker who had just sneered at me in the funeral home was a common thief. The custom Tom Ford suit he wore today, the brand new Porsche he bought for my spoiled sister Brittany last week, the lavish country club memberships my mother flaunted, every single luxury was funded by stolen money. Terrence had laundered the stolen millions through dummy corporations tied to his elite investment brokerage firm. My mother, Patricia, was a fully aware accomplice, signing off on fraudulent medical evaluations to keep my grandfather legally incapacitated. Terrence's loud mockery at the funeral was not just natural arrogance. It was the desperate overcompensation of a criminal trying to project supreme power while covering up a massive federal felony. A heavy, rapid knocking on the reinforced steel door of the vault interrupted my reading. Mr. Cole rushed to open it. 3 men in dark suits stepped into the underground room. The lead man pulled out a leather wallet flashing a gold badge. He introduced himself as Special Agent Ramirez with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in white-collar financial crimes. Agent Ramirez looked at the open safe deposit box and let out a long, heavy breath. He explained that the FBI had been investigating Terrence and his shady investment firm for 6 entire months. They knew Terrence was running a massive wire fraud and tax evasion syndicate, but they desperately lacked the core offshore routing numbers to secure a federal indictment. My grandfather had spent his final years acting as an undercover informant inside his own house, compiling the exact financial footprint the federal government needed to destroy Terrence. Agent Ramirez then handed me a terrifying preliminary toxicology report. The hospice nurses suspected that my grandfather did not die of natural causes. The data showed that his essential heart medication had been deliberately withheld and replaced with cheap placebos over the last 48 hours. Patricia and Terrence had essentially murdered him to expedite their total control over the estate before any auditors could look into the shrinking retirement accounts. Agent Ramirez looked me dead in the eye and told me I was in extreme danger. He instructed me to step away from the documents and let the federal forensics team process the evidence. Just as he spoke, my phone vibrated heavily in my coat pocket. I pulled it out. The screen lit up with a text message from my mother. It read, "Get back to the suburban house for dinner tonight. Terrence has a legal waiver of inheritance you need to sign immediately. Do not waste his valuable time, or we will have you permanently banned from the burial service tomorrow." I showed the glowing screen to Agent Ramirez. A cold, calculating smile spread across my face. My family thought I was just a financially struggling, easily intimidated data analyst who would sign away my rights just to keep the peace. They had no idea I was currently standing inside a federal crime scene, holding the weapon that would obliterate their entire existence. I looked at the federal agent and told him to wire me with a hidden microphone. I was going to walk right into their dinner trap, play the pathetic older sister they expected me to be, and let them dig their own graves with their own arrogant words. At my grandfather's funeral, his trembling fingers pressed a worn leather passbook into my palm just moments before he passed away. Before I could even process my grief, my mother snatched it from my hands and tossed it straight into the garbage bin. She hissed that it was old trash and told me to stop embarrassing our wealthy family in front of the elite guests. I did not shed a single tear. I just calmly retrieved the book from the trash and drove straight to the bank. When the manager scanned the barcode on the back, the blood completely drained from his face. He locked his office door and whispered that we needed to call the police and that I absolutely could not leave the room. My name is Valerie. I am 33 years old and work as a financial data analyst in Boston. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up in a sprawling suburban mansion in Massachusetts meant absolute privilege to outsiders. But inside our pristine walls, emotional manipulation was the daily currency. My mother, Patricia, cared only about country club memberships and appearances. My younger sister, Brittany, was her undisputed golden child. While Brittany received luxury cars and endless praise, I was treated like an inconvenient roommate. I paid for my own college with massive student loans while my family flaunted their wealth. I learned early on that silence and observation were my best survival tools. The brass trash receptacle gleamed under the harsh chandelier lighting of the funeral home. My grandfather's worn leather passbook lay discarded inside, resting against used tissues and crumpled memorial programs. For a fraction of a second, the entire viewing room felt completely devoid of oxygen. I could feel the burning weight of Patricia's glare on my skin. I could hear the faint rustle of Terrence shifting his weight in his custom Tom Ford suit, entirely amused by my humiliation. Brittany stood right beside him, her lips curled into a perfectly painted smirk behind her oversized designer sunglasses. They all waited for the inevitable breakdown. They waited for me to burst into tears, to beg for their acceptance, to apologize for ruining their elite social performance. That was the reaction they had conditioned me to provide for 33 years. But today was different. My grandfather had just taken his last breath, and with him died the final shred of obligation I felt toward these people. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or offer a desperate defense of my own worth. As a data analyst, I process facts, and the fact standing right in front of me was that my biological family was completely morally bankrupt. I calmly knelt down on the polished marble floor. The fabric of my simple, outdated black dress stretched tightly across my shoulders, a sharp contrast to the thousands of dollars worth of couture standing above me. I reached my hand directly into the trash bin. My fingers brushed against the discarded debris until I felt the familiar rough texture of the frayed leather binding. I pulled the passbook out and stood back up. I took my time brushing a speck of dust from the cover, treating the small object with the absolute reverence that my grandfather deserved. Patricia gasped softly, clearly appalled that I would willingly reach into the garbage in front of the local politicians and real estate developers she was trying so desperately to impress. She opened her mouth to whisper another venomous insult, but I cut her off by stepping directly into her personal space. I looked straight into her eyes, then shifted my cold gaze to Brittany and finally to Terrence. I did not blink. I did not shrink away. I would rather hold on to his trash than keep the title of family with any of you, I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any sorrow or rage. It was the absolute, undeniable truth delivered with lethal precision. The smug satisfaction instantly melted off Terrence's face, replaced by a flash of genuine irritation. Brittany actually took a step backward, her designer heels clicking sharply against the marble. Patricia's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with a mix of fury and embarrassment. She raised her hand as if to grab my arm and scold me like a disobedient child, but I had already turned my back on them. I walked down the long central aisle of the viewing room. The heavy scent of white lilies and expensive perfumes clung to the air, suffocating and artificial. Every step I took away from them felt like shedding a massive, suffocating weight. I did not look back at the casket. I had already said my true goodbyes to my grandfather in the quiet hours of the morning, long before the vultures descended. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the funeral parlor and stepped out into the biting chill of the Massachusetts afternoon. The crisp, cold air hit my face, clearing my lungs instantly. I walked across the sprawling parking lot, navigating past the line of luxury SUVs and imported sports cars until I reached my modest, reliable sedan. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and locked it behind me. The silence inside the car was absolute. I placed the worn leather passbook on the passenger seat and just stared at it for a long moment. My grandfather was a meticulous, brilliant man who had built a logistics empire from the ground up. He never did anything without a calculated reason. He did not press a worthless, outdated bankbook into my hands on his deathbed for the sake of nostalgia. There was a hidden variable in this equation, and I was going to find it. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the Oakwood Memorial Funeral Home in my rearview mirror. I merged onto the highway, heading straight toward the heart of downtown Boston. The city skyline rose in the distance, a concrete jungle of financial institutions and corporate power. My mind raced, processing the data points of the last 5 years. Terrence suddenly acquiring massive wealth shortly after getting my grandfather's medical power of attorney. Patricia's sudden influx of cash and sudden eagerness to keep my grandfather heavily medicated in that facility. Brittany's endless shopping sprees funded by a brother-in-law who always seemed to have unlimited liquid assets. The math had never added up. The financial anomaly was glaring, and the key to unraveling it was sitting right next to me on the passenger seat. I navigated the dense afternoon traffic, my grip tight on the steering wheel. I was no longer the scapegoat sister. I was no longer the disappointing daughter who had to take out massive student loans while her sister drove a brand new Porsche. I was a professional auditor of truth. I pulled into a parking garage located just 2 blocks away from the financial district. I grabbed the passbook, tucked it securely inside my coat pocket, and walked out onto the bustling sidewalk. The towering glass and steel facade of the Bank of America main branch loomed over the street. The building was a fortress of wealth, intimidating and sterile. I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the expansive lobby. The polished floors gleamed under the recessed lighting, and the low hum of banking transactions echoed off the high ceilings. I bypassed the waiting area and walked directly up to the nearest available teller. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable. I reached into my coat, pulled out the frayed piece of leather that my family had deemed garbage, and placed it firmly on the cool marble counter. I was ready to decipher my grandfather's final message, no matter what truth it unleashed. The polished marble floor of the Bank of America main branch echoed with the muted, efficient sounds of high-level financial transactions. The air inside the building was cool and sterile, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and freshly printed currency. It was a stark, welcome contrast to the suffocating stench of the funeral home I had just escaped. I stood in the exact center of the lobby, letting the clinical atmosphere wash over me. I was completely composed. My family was busy staging their pathetic performance for the local politicians back at the viewing room, entirely unaware that I held the key to their destruction in my coat pocket. I walked straight past the velvet ropes of the waiting area and approached the nearest available teller. She was a young woman with a crisp blue scarf and a highly practiced corporate smile. She greeted me with a cheerful, rehearsed line, clearly expecting a routine deposit or a simple account inquiry. I did not return her smile. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the frayed, worn leather passbook my grandfather had pressed into my hand, and placed it flat on the cool marble counter. I told her I needed to access the account associated with this book. The teller looked down at the battered leather as if I had just placed a piece of garbage on her pristine workstation. Her smile faltered slightly. She picked up the passbook with manicured fingers, treating it with obvious disdain, and opened it to the first page. She typed the embossed account number into her keyboard. A slight frown creased her forehead. She hit the backspace key and typed the numbers again, her nails clicking sharply against the plastic keys. I watched her screen reflect in her glasses. She shook her head and offered a polite, condescending apology. She stated that the account format did not match their current registry and suggested that the book was likely decades old and completely deactivated. She tried to slide the passbook back across the counter toward me, eager to dismiss the grieving woman in the outdated black dress. I did not move my hand to take it back. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly rigid. I told her to look closer. I told her to escalate the request to her supervisor immediately. As a data analyst, I know that numbers never simply disappear from a mainframe. My grandfather, William Caldwell, was a man of absolute precision who built a massive logistics empire from nothing. He did not make mistakes, and he certainly did not use his final dying breath to hand me a deactivated relic. The teller sighed a subtle sound of corporate annoyance and picked up her desk phone. She dialed an internal extension, shielding her mouth with her hand, as she murmured something about a difficult customer. Within 2 minutes, a man walked out of the glass-enclosed executive offices lining the perimeter of the lobby. This was Richard Cole, the branch manager. He wore a charcoal-tailored suit projecting an aura of absolute financial authority and supreme confidence. He approached the counter with a smooth, purposeful stride, offering me a polite but dismissive greeting. He was clearly expecting to resolve a simple customer service dispute with a confused, emotional relative who did not understand modern banking. Mr. Cole picked up the leather passbook from the counter. His seasoned eyes scanned the front cover, and his dismissive attitude remained intact. He opened the pages, looking at the blank lines. Then he flipped the book over, running his thumb along the worn spine. Suddenly, he stopped. His breathing shifted, catching slightly in his throat. He turned the book toward the harsh fluorescent light overhead and angled it carefully. Stamped directly into the leather on the lower left corner of the back cover was a faded, almost invisible barcode. It was not a standard routing number. It was a highly complex cryptographic identifier. Mr. Cole did not hand the book back to the teller. He did not hand it back to me. His professional, arrogant smile completely vanished, replaced by an expression of deep, intense focus. He looked at me, his eyes assessing me in a completely new light. He asked me to follow him to his private office immediately. He did not wait for my response. He turned on his heel and walked swiftly back toward the executive wing. I followed him, leaving the confused teller behind. We stepped into his spacious office. It was a testament to corporate success, filled with modern art and heavy leather chairs. Mr. Cole walked behind his massive mahogany desk. He did not offer me a seat. He bypassed his primary computer and booted up a secure secondary terminal, a thick black machine separate from the main customer database. He reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a specialized handheld scanner. I noticed that his hand was visibly trembling. He aligned the red laser of the scanner with the faded barcode on the back of my grandfather's passbook. The scanner emitted a sharp, piercing electronic beep. Instantly, the large monitor on his desk went completely black. A split second later, a solid red warning banner flashed across the entire screen. The glaring crimson light illuminated Mr. Cole's face, casting harsh shadows across his features. I watched in total silence as all the blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. His jaw dropped slightly, and his eyes widened in sheer, unfiltered terror. He stared at the glowing red screen, as if he had just triggered a live explosive device right on his desk. As a data analyst, I read behavioral patterns just as well as I read spreadsheets. The man standing in front of me was not experiencing a technical glitch. He was looking at a catastrophic system override. The screen displayed rows of heavily encrypted federal codes locking down the terminal entirely. Mr. Cole staggered backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the hardwood floor as he bumped into the wall behind him. He let out a ragged gasp, lunging toward the heavy glass door of his office. He grabbed the deadbolt and locked it with a loud metallic snap. He then reached for the automated switch on the wall, bringing down the thick privacy blinds and plunging the room into artificial shadow. We were completely sealed off from the rest of the bank, hidden from the view of the lobby. He backed away from the door, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw in oxygen. He reached for his desk phone, his fingers shaking so violently he knocked a pen holder off his desk. It crashed to the floor, but he did not even look down. He gripped the phone receiver like a lifeline. He looked at me, his eyes wide and wild with a panic that sent a cold, sharp shiver straight down my spine. "Call the police right now," he whispered. His voice cracked, completely devoid of any of his previous corporate polish. "You absolutely cannot leave this room." The polished brass of the garbage receptacle gleamed under the harsh chandelier lighting of the funeral home. It was a beautiful, sterile container designed to hide discarded things, and right now, it held the very last physical connection I had to my grandfather. For a fraction of a second, the entire viewing room felt completely devoid of oxygen. I could feel the burning weight of Patricia's glare on my skin. I could hear the faint rustle of Terrence shifting his weight in his custom Tom Ford suit, entirely amused by my public humiliation. Brittany stood right beside him, her lips curled into a perfectly painted smirk behind her oversized designer sunglasses. They all stood there in absolute silence, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. They waited for me to burst into tears, to beg for their acceptance, to apologize for ruining their elite social performance. That was the reaction they had conditioned me to provide for 33 years. They thrived on my insecurity. They fed on my desperation to belong. But today was different. My grandfather had just taken his last breath, and with him died the final shred of obligation I felt toward these toxic people. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or offer a desperate defense of my own worth. As a data analyst, I process facts, and the fact standing right in front of me was that my biological family was completely morally bankrupt. They were parasites dressed in high fashion, feeding off the legacy of a man they had locked away. I calmly knelt down on the cold marble floor. The fabric of my simple, outdated black dress stretched tightly across my shoulders, a sharp contrast to the thousands of dollars worth of couture standing above me. I reached my hand directly into the trash bin. I did not care who was watching. I did not care about the local politicians or the wealthy real estate developers murmuring in the background. My fingers brushed against crumpled tissues and discarded memorial programs, until I felt the familiar rough texture of the frayed leather binding. I pulled the passbook out and stood back up. I took my time brushing a speck of dust from the cover, treating the small object with the absolute reverence that my grandfather deserved. Patricia gasped softly, clearly appalled that I would willingly reach into the garbage in front of the exact people she was trying so desperately to impress. She opened her mouth to whisper another venomous insult, fully expecting me to cower, but I cut her off by stepping directly into her personal space. I looked straight into her eyes, then shifted my cold gaze to Brittany, and finally to Terrence. I did not blink. I did not shrink away. The air between us grew thick with unspoken tension. I would rather hold on to his trash than keep the title of family with any of you. I delivered the words with lethal precision. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any sorrow or rage. It was a statement of absolute, undeniable truth. The smug satisfaction instantly melted off Terrence's face, replaced by a flash of genuine irritation. His towering presence and expensive watch suddenly looked ridiculous against the cold reality of my statement. Brittany actually took a step backward, her designer heels clicking sharply against the marble, her smirk vanishing completely. Patricia's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with a mix of fury and intense embarrassment. She raised her hand as if to grab my arm and scold me like a disobedient child, but I had already turned my back on them. I walked down the long central aisle of the viewing room. The heavy scent of white lilies and expensive perfumes clung to the air, suffocating and artificial. Every single step I took away from them felt like shedding a massive, suffocating weight. I did not look back at the casket. I had already said my true goodbyes to my grandfather in the quiet hours of the morning, long before the vultures descended upon his legacy. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the funeral parlor and stepped out into the biting chill of the Massachusetts afternoon. The crisp, cold air hit my face, clearing my lungs instantly. I walked across the sprawling parking lot, navigating past the line of luxury SUVs and imported sports cars, until I reached my modest, reliable sedan. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and locked it securely behind me. The silence inside the car was absolute and incredibly peaceful. I placed the worn leather passbook on the passenger seat and just stared at it for a long moment. My grandfather was a meticulous, brilliant man who had built a massive logistics empire from the ground up. He never did anything without a highly calculated reason. He did not press a worthless, outdated bank book into my hands on his deathbed for the sake of mere nostalgia. He was sending me a message. There was a hidden variable in this equation, and I was going to find it. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the funeral home and my toxic relatives in my rearview mirror. I merged onto the highway, heading straight toward the heart of downtown Boston. The city skyline rose in the distance, a towering concrete jungle of financial institutions and corporate power. As I drove, my mind raced, processing the data points of the last 5 years with extreme clarity. I thought about how Terrence had constantly belittled my career as a data analyst, calling me a glorified spreadsheet reader while he paraded around as a high-rolling investment broker. Yet he was the one who suddenly acquired massive wealth shortly after securing my grandfather's medical power of attorney. I thought about Patricia's sudden influx of cash and her eager willingness to keep my grandfather heavily medicated in that care facility. I thought about Brittany's endless shopping sprees, funded by a husband who always seemed to have unlimited liquid assets at his immediate disposal. The math had never added up. The financial anomaly was glaring, and the key to unraveling it was sitting right next to me on the passenger seat. I navigated the dense afternoon traffic, my grip tight and steady on the steering wheel. I was no longer the scapegoat sister. I was no longer the disappointing daughter who had to take out massive student loans while her sister drove a brand new sports car. I was a professional auditor of truth, and I was about to audit my own family. I pulled into a parking garage located just 2 blocks away from the financial district. I grabbed the passbook, tucked it securely inside my coat pocket, and walked out onto the bustling sidewalk. The towering glass and steel facade of the Bank of America main branch loomed over the street. The building was a fortress of wealth, intimidating, massive, and sterile. I took one final deep breath, pushing through the heavy revolving glass doors. I stepped into the expansive lobby, entirely ready to uncover whatever dangerous secret my grandfather had left behind. A heavy, rapid knocking echoed against the reinforced steel door of the underground vault. Mr. Cole practically lunged across the small room to unlock the heavy deadbolt. I expected to see local Boston police officers rushing in with standard uniforms and radios. Instead, 3 men in dark, unremarkable suits stepped into the cramped, climate-controlled space. The lead man pulled out a leather wallet, flashing a gold shield under the harsh fluorescent lights. He introduced himself as Special Agent Ramirez, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a senior operative specializing in high-level white-collar financial crimes. Agent Ramirez looked at the open safe deposit box, then at the terrified bank manager, and finally his sharp gaze landed on me. He let out a long, heavy breath, the sound incredibly loud in the dead silence of the vault. He immediately ordered Mr. Cole to step outside and secure the perimeter of the executive wing, ensuring absolutely no bank personnel or private security guards interrupted us. Once the heavy metal door clicked shut, leaving just the federal agents and me, Agent Ramirez dropped a bombshell that completely rewired my entire understanding of my so-called family. He explained that the federal government had been closely monitoring my brother-in-law Terrence and his flashy investment brokerage firm for the past 6 months. Terrence was not the financial genius he pretended to be at family dinners. He was running a highly sophisticated multi-state money laundering syndicate. The FBI knew Terrence was moving illicit funds and evading taxes on a massive scale, but their federal investigation had hit a massive concrete wall. They desperately lacked the core offshore routing numbers and the initial source of the stolen capital required to secure a federal indictment. Agent Ramirez pointed to the black encrypted USB drive resting in my hands. He told me that my grandfather William had contacted a federal informant several months ago. My grandfather had spent his final years trapped inside that high-end care facility, acting as a covert operative inside his own life. He had meticulously compiled the exact financial footprint the federal government needed to destroy Terrence completely. I plugged the USB drive into a secure offline federal terminal that one of the agents provided. As a data analyst, my eyes rapidly scanned the rows of highly organized spreadsheets, bank transfers, and digitized legal documents that populated the screen. The numbers screamed the undeniable truth. The entire narrative of my grandfather's dementia was a carefully orchestrated lie designed to justify a fraudulent medical power of attorney. The digitized documents proved that Terrence had actively coerced my grandfather and forged his signature on that specific medical power of attorney. Using that absolute legal control over his healthcare and estate, Terrence systematically drained exactly $4.5 million from my grandfather's corporate retirement funds. He funneled the cash through a complex web of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, washing the money clean before bringing it back into his elite Boston brokerage firm. That was exactly how Terrence afforded the custom Tom Ford suits he flaunted at the funeral. That was how he bought my sister Brittany a brand new Porsche last week. Every single ounce of their upper-class arrogance was funded by grand theft. But Terrence did not act alone. A secondary encrypted folder on the drive contained highly classified bank statements bearing my mother's name. Patricia was a fully aware, highly compensated accomplice. She had signed off on fake medical evaluations to keep my grandfather legally incapacitated and locked away from any outside financial auditors. In exchange for her silence and cooperation, Terrence had wired hundreds of thousands of dollars into her private offshore accounts. My own mother had sold her father's freedom for designer handbags, luxury vacations, and country club dues. Then, Agent Ramirez pulled a physical manila folder from his briefcase and placed it gently on the aluminum table. He looked me dead in the eye, his expression entirely devoid of pity, offering only cold, professional gravity. He handed me a preliminary toxicology report and a series of covert communications intercepted from the hospice facility staff. The data showed a lethal sudden spike in my grandfather's blood pressure over the last 48 hours. My grandfather did not die of natural causes or advanced age. The medical records and intercepted messages proved that Patricia had explicitly instructed a compromised private nurse to deliberately withhold his essential life-saving heart medication. They replaced his actual pills with useless placebos. As the $4.5 million theft grew too large to hide and an annual corporate audit loomed closer, Patricia and Terrence panicked. They essentially murdered my grandfather in cold blood to expedite their total control over the estate before the financial authorities could look into the rapidly shrinking retirement accounts. I stared at the toxicology report. The clinical black and white text confirmed that my mother had executed my grandfather for money. She had watched him take his last agonizing breath this morning, snatched the passbook from my hands, and worried only about impressing her wealthy political friends at the funeral viewing. I did not scream. I did not collapse onto the cold floor of the vault. I felt my heart rate slow down to a steady rhythmic beat. The heavy grief that had weighed on my chest all morning entirely evaporated, replaced by a crystalline absolute focus. I was looking at a complete dataset of betrayal, massive financial fraud, and premeditated murder. I looked back up at Agent Ramirez. He told me that the FBI had enough evidence to arrest them eventually, but they needed to catch Terrence in the act of transferring the remaining assets to solidify the federal case beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt. He needed my help to set the final trap. He needed me to walk back into the viper's nest and play my assigned role as the weak, submissive older sister. I nodded once. A cold, calculating smile spread across my face. My family thought I was nothing but a struggling, invisible data analyst who would bend to their will. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the executioner's blade, and I was going to use it to cut them down to nothing. Agent Ramirez looked at me with a hardened, professional expression. He explained that having the offshore routing numbers and the medical reports was a massive breakthrough, but it was not enough to guarantee a conviction that would lock Terrence and Patricia away for decades. To secure a federal indictment for wire fraud, money laundering, and elder financial abuse without the possibility of parole, the Bureau needed one final piece of the puzzle. They needed a direct, undeniable admission of guilt. They needed Terrence to openly discuss the forged medical power of attorney and the missing $4.5 million. More importantly, they needed him to attempt to execute the final stage of his fraud on the official record. Ramirez asked for my absolute silence regarding everything I had just seen. He told me that any sudden change in my behavior could immediately tip them off. If Terrence even suspected that the federal government was monitoring his corporate accounts, he would instantly wire the remaining stolen funds to an untouchable jurisdiction in the Caribbean and board a private flight out of the country before midnight. The special agent asked if I was willing to wear a federal micro-recording device. He needed me to walk right back into the viper's nest and play the exact role my family expected me to play. I had to be the submissive, financially struggling older sister who would sign whatever legal document they put in front of her just to avoid a humiliating argument. I did not hesitate for a single second. I looked at the federal agent and told him to wire me up immediately. As a data analyst, I understand that the most efficient way to catch a parasite is to offer it exactly what it wants to consume. I felt absolutely no fear. I felt a profound, cold clarity. Right at that exact moment, the heavy silence of the underground vault was shattered by the sharp, vibrating buzz of my cell phone. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the device. The bright screen illuminated the dim, metallic room. It was a text message from my mother, Patricia. I read the words displayed on the screen, my eyes narrowing at her predictable audacity. The text read, "Come back to the mansion for dinner tonight. I have a paper you need to sign. Do not waste Terrence's time." I let out a short, hollow laugh that echoed off the thick steel walls of the vault. The sheer arrogance of her timing was almost poetic. My grandfather had not even been dead for 12 hours. His body still lying in that suffocating funeral home, and Patricia was already summoning me to sign away my legal rights. She was not asking me to dinner to comfort me in my grief. She was calling me in to execute the final phase of their financial heist. I turned the phone screen around and showed the message directly to Agent Ramirez. I pointed out the specific phrasing. Patricia was trying to manipulate me with a false sense of urgency. She was using Terrence's supposedly valuable time as a weapon to pressure me into signing a legal document without reading it properly. I told the agents that this paper she mentioned was undoubtedly a waiver of inheritance. Terrence needed me to legally forfeit my rights to the estate so he could freely liquidate the remaining assets and transfer the cash to his offshore shell companies without any interference from the probate court. Agent Ramirez nodded slowly, a predatory gleam appearing in his dark eyes. He agreed that this dinner was the perfect trap. He gestured to one of his subordinate agents, who immediately opened a secure black briefcase resting on the aluminum table. The agent pulled out a highly advanced micro-transmitter. It was incredibly small, no larger than a standard shirt button equipped with military-grade audio capture technology. The female agent approached me and carefully attached the device to the underside of my collar, hiding it seamlessly within the dark fabric of my dress. She ran a quick audio test confirming that the transmitter was broadcasting a crystal-clear signal directly to the federal surveillance van that would be parked discreetly outside my mother's suburban estate tonight. Agent Ramirez stepped right in front of me, establishing intense eye contact. He gave me a set of strict operational directives. He instructed me to let Terrence do all the talking. I was not to accuse them of murder or theft. I had to act completely intimidated. I had to ask innocent clarifying questions about the document they wanted me to sign. The goal was to make Terrence feel so supremely confident and intellectually superior that he would openly brag about his financial maneuvers and expose his own fraud. I promised the agents that I would deliver exactly what they needed. I knew how to handle Terrence. He was a textbook narcissist who thrived on putting me down to elevate his own status. All I had to do was stroke his massive ego play into his narrative of being the wealthy savior of the family, and he would gladly hand me the rope to hang him with. Mr. Cole, the bank manager who had been standing silently in the corner, unlocked the heavy vault door. I stepped out of the underground room, leaving the box of damning evidence securely in federal custody. I rode the private elevator back up to the main lobby, walked past the oblivious bank tellers, and stepped back out into the freezing Boston air. I walked to my car with a completely new sense of purpose. The heavy, suffocating grief that had plagued me all morning was entirely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. I slid into the driver's seat, gripped the steering wheel and stared at the digital clock on the dashboard. I had a few hours before the dinner. I needed to go home, change into something that looked appropriately pathetic for their elite standards, and mentally prepare for the performance of a lifetime. I picked up my phone and replied to Patricia's text message with a simple, obedient confirmation. I typed, "I will be there. Tell Terrence I will not take up too much of his time." I hit send and started the engine. I was driving straight into the tiger's den, but I was not walking in as prey. I was walking in as the architect of their absolute destruction. They thought they were inviting the family failure to dinner so they could steal the last remaining scraps of my grandfather's legacy. They had absolutely no idea they had just invited the federal government to the table. The drive to my mother's suburban estate took exactly 42 minutes. I utilized every single second of that commute to meticulously calibrate my demeanor. As a data analyst, I understand that the success of any algorithm depends entirely on the quality of the input. Tonight, my family required a specific input. They needed the exhausted, financially insecure, and easily manipulated older sister. I adjusted my rearview mirror, practicing a look of profound defeat. Underneath the collar of my simple black dress, the federal microtransmitter rested flat and cold against my collarbone. It was the only armor I needed. I turned off the main highway and navigated the winding tree-lined streets of the exclusive gated community. The massive estates sat far back from the road, insulated by manicured hedges and wrought iron fences. About half a mile from my mother's property, I noticed a plain, unmarked utility van parked discreetly near a fire hydrant. To anyone else, it was just a local telecommunications crew working a late shift. But I knew Agent Ramirez and his federal surveillance team were inside, actively monitoring the encrypted audio frequency currently broadcasting from my chest. I gave the van a brief, imperceptible nod as I drove past. I pulled my reliable, outdated sedan into the expansive circular driveway of the mansion. It was parked right next to the brand-new, gleaming silver Porsche Terrence had purchased for Brittany last week. The visual contrast between our vehicles was almost poetic. One was bought with honest wages, the other with the stolen retirement funds of a murdered old man. I gripped the steering wheel tightly for a brief moment, centering my heart rate. I stepped out into the biting evening air, walked up the wide stone steps, and pushed open the heavy mahogany front door. I did not bother knocking. I still legally had a key, even if I was rarely welcome. I expected the house to be somber. My grandfather had literally died that very morning. Instead, the faint sound of upbeat jazz music echoed down the vaulted hallway. The rich, savory aroma of private catering filled the air. There were no mirrors covered, no quiet reflections, no mourning. It felt exactly like a victory party. I walked slowly down the long corridor, my footsteps muffled by the plush Persian runners. Every piece of expensive art on the walls, Every crystal vase on the side tables suddenly looked like highly classified evidence of a federal crime. I reached the entrance of the formal dining room and paused in the archway. The scene playing out in front of me was a masterclass in absolute moral bankruptcy. My mother, Patricia, sat at the head of the massive custom dining table, admiring a heavy diamond bracelet on her wrist. My sister Brittany was leaning back in a velvet chair, laughing loudly at something her husband had just said. Terence stood near the custom-built mahogany wet bar at the far end of the room. He had discarded his suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white designer shirt to display his heavy gold Rolex. In his hands he held a chilled bottle of vintage Armand de Brignac champagne, a bottle that easily retailed for $2,000. He popped the cork with a loud celebratory crack, pouring the bubbling liquid into 3 crystal flutes. They were literally toasting to my grandfather's death. They were celebrating the successful execution of their $4.5 million heist. I stepped fully into the dining room. The heavy soles of my sensible work shoes clicked against the marble floor, announcing my presence. The laughter instantly died in Brittany's throat. Patricia dropped her wrist, her smile vanishing as she quickly rearranged her features into a mask of mild, irritated impatience. Terence paused mid-pour, glancing at me over his shoulder with a look of supreme, unchecked arrogance. "Valerie," Terence drawled, stretching my name out with lazy condescension. "You actually made it. I was starting to think you got lost on the way back from your little dumpster diving expedition at the funeral home." He handed a glass of the $2,000 champagne to Brittany, who took it with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. He did not offer one to me. I kept my shoulders slumped, forcing my eyes to look at the floor before making tentative eye contact. I told them the traffic was heavy. I kept my voice intentionally quiet, injecting just enough exhaustion into my tone to make them feel utterly superior. The microphone under my collar captured every single syllable perfectly in the quiet, expansive room. Brittany took a slow sip of her champagne, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "You are still wearing that same depressing dress. Honestly, Valerie, you could have at least changed into something that does not smell like a cheap thrift store. We have private catering arriving in 20 minutes, and you are completely ruining the aesthetic of my dining room." Patricia waved a manicured hand, cutting off Brittany's insults. "Leave her alone, Brittany. Valerie has had a very long, very emotional day. We all have." Patricia's voice dripped with fake, sugary maternal concern that made my stomach churn. She pointed to a stiff wooden chair at the far end of the long table, distancing me from their celebratory cluster. "Have a seat, Valerie. Terence is a very busy man, and he has generously taken time out of his evening to handle a massive burden for this family. We need to get down to business quickly." I walked over to the wooden chair and sat down obediently. I placed my worn purse on the floor, keeping my hands folded neatly in my lap. I looked up at Terence, widening my eyes slightly to project a look of helpless confusion. I asked him what business we possibly needed to discuss on the exact day our grandfather passed away. Terence let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He walked slowly toward the center of the dining table, taking a sip from his crystal flute. He looked down at me as if I was an insect he was preparing to crush under his expensive Italian leather shoes. He reached into the inner pocket of his discarded suit jacket, resting on a nearby chair, and pulled out a thick, professionally bound legal document. He did not hand it to me gently. He tossed the heavy stack of papers across the polished wood of the dining table. The document slid across the smooth surface and hit the edge of my hands with a loud, decisive slap. I looked down at the bold, capitalized letters printed across the top of the first page. It read, "Waiver of inheritance and full relinquishment of estate claims." "This is the paperwork," Terence said, his deep voice echoing with absolute unchecked authority. "You are going to sign this right now, Valerie. You are going to sign away every single legal right you think you have to that old man's estate, and you are going to let me clean up the massive, catastrophic financial mess he just left behind." The trap was officially set. I stared at the fraudulent legal document resting on the table. I could feel the cold metal of the federal transmitter humming against my skin. They thought they were cornering a weak, defenseless woman. They had no idea they had just handed a loaded weapon to their own executioner. I stared down at the thick stack of legal papers resting on the polished mahogany table. The bold black letters on the first page seemed to mock me. I kept my face entirely blank, letting the silence stretch out just long enough to make them feel powerful. I slowly looked up at Terence. He was swirling the expensive champagne in his crystal flute, looking down at me with an expression of supreme unearned pity. I asked him what kind of catastrophic financial mess he was talking about. I kept my voice intentionally small, injecting a slight tremor into my words to simulate genuine panic. I reminded them that our grandfather had built a highly successful logistics empire from the ground up. I said I always assumed he was incredibly wealthy and that the estate would be perfectly secure. Terence let out a harsh, patronizing laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling of the dining room. He set his glass down on the wet bar with a loud clink and began to pace the length of the extravagant space. He told me that my naive assumption was exactly the problem with people who did not understand high-level finance. He said everyone outside his tax bracket assumed the old man was a financial genius, but the reality behind closed doors was nothing short of a complete disaster. Terence unbuttoned his cuffs and rolled up the sleeves of his designer shirt, preparing to deliver his grand fabricated performance. He looked me dead in the eye and delivered the lie with absolutely flawless conviction. He stated that my grandfather was completely and irreversibly bankrupt. He claimed the logistics company had been bleeding cash for over a decade, and the old man had been taking out massive unregulated loans from dangerous creditors just to keep up appearances in their elite social circles. Terence shook his head, feigning deep masculine disappointment. He told me that the worst part was not the terrible business investments or the hidden debts. The worst part, he emphasized with a dramatic pause, was the massive tax evasion. According to Terence, my grandfather had hidden assets in dummy accounts and lied on his federal tax returns for years. The Internal Revenue Service had finally caught up with his fraudulent accounting. Terence leaned heavily against the back of my mother's velvet chair, letting the imaginary gravity of the situation sink in. He announced that the estate was completely underwater, buried beneath a staggering $2 million federal tax debt. He said the IRS was preparing to seize everything, absolutely every remaining physical asset and property, to cover the back taxes and the crippling federal penalties. My mother, Patricia, immediately jumped in to play her supporting role in this highly rehearsed theatrical production. She placed her manicured hand over her heart, looking thoroughly devastated. She told me she was entirely heartbroken when Terence uncovered this disgraceful secret debt last week. She claimed she could barely sleep knowing her own father had disgraced their elite family name and put them all at risk. She looked at me with wide fake tears forming in her eyes and said the federal government could freeze all their personal accounts and put liens on this very mansion if the massive debt was not settled immediately. She played the terrified matriarch, perfectly masking her own complicity in murder behind a veil of financial anxiety. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their deception. The hidden microphone under my collar was capturing every single syllable of this incredibly elaborate scheme. Terence was not just lying to me to save face. He was actively committing federal wire fraud on a recorded line, fabricating a fake IRS debt to coerce me into signing away my legal rights. He was using the very agency that was currently parked in a surveillance van outside the house as his imaginary weapon of terror. Brittany rolled her eyes from across the table, taking another large gulp of her vintage champagne. She told me to stop looking like a shocked idiot and just be eternally grateful. She sneered that if it were not for her highly successful husband, the federal government would be auditing my pathetic data analyst salary next. She said Terence was the only reason this family was not going to be completely ruined and humiliated in the press by tomorrow morning. I looked back at Terence, forcing my eyes to widen in simulated fear. I asked him what we were supposed to do about a $2 million debt to the federal government. I asked how we could possibly pay that kind of money before the authorities seized the estate and destroyed our lives. That was his exact cue. Terence stood up straight, puffing out his broad chest, stepping fully into the role of the wealthy, benevolent savior. He walked over to the dining table and tapped a heavy gold pen against the top of the legal document he had thrown at me. He said he was going to take care of it. He declared that for the sake of Patricia, for the sake of his beautiful wife Brittany, and to protect the esteemed family name from public humiliation, he was going to shoulder the entire crushing burden himself. He bragged that he had the liquid capital ready to go in his offshore accounts. He said he was going to write a personal check for $2 million and pay off the IRS tomorrow morning out of his own pocket. He painted himself as a saint, a man stepping up to clean up the disgraceful criminal mess left behind by a senile old man. Then came the catch. He leaned down, placing both his hands flat on the table, bringing his face uncomfortably close to mine. The smell of expensive cologne and alcohol washed over my face. He told me that the federal auditors were ruthless and required absolute streamlined communication. He said he could not have a financially illiterate data analyst slowing down the legal process or questioning his complex negotiations with the government. He pointed a sharp finger directly at the waiver of inheritance. He stated that in exchange for him paying off this massive debt and saving me from federal scrutiny, I had to sign this document immediately. I had to permanently relinquish every single legal right, claim, and title to my grandfather's estate. By signing, I would grant Terence absolute legal authority to deal with the assets and the IRS without ever needing my signature or approval again. He framed it as a massive, life-saving favor. He was protecting me from liability. He was absorbing all the risk. All I had to do was sign my name on the dotted line and walk away free and clear. I looked down at the thick paper. It was a masterpiece of legal manipulation. If I signed it, I would willingly forfeit my entire inheritance. Terence would use this document to bypass the probate court, liquidate the remaining assets, cover up his $4.5 million theft, and launder the rest of the money offshore before anyone could blink. He thought he was absolutely brilliant. He thought his intimidation tactics and his fake financial crisis were working perfectly on his weak sister-in-law. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy gold pen. My hand trembled slightly, a carefully calculated physical reaction to sell my performance. I kept my head bowed, allowing the microphone to pick up the ragged, nervous breath I purposefully drew in. I asked him if he was absolutely sure that signing this paper would keep the federal government away from me. I asked if this would really solve the entire problem forever. Terence smiled a wide, predatory grin that showed all of his perfectly white teeth. He promised me that as soon as my signature hit the paper, the federal government would be his problem alone. I gripped the pen tightly, keeping my face hidden. I knew that for the first time in his miserable, arrogant life, Terence had just told the absolute truth. The federal government was about to become entirely his problem. I kept my hand hovering over the thick, expensive paper, the heavy gold pen gripped tightly between my fingers. The silence in the dining room stretched out, buzzing with the electric anticipation of their impending victory. Terence was already taking a celebratory step back, a smug grin plastered across his face, fully believing he had successfully cornered his weak sister-in-law. But I did not bring the tip of the pen down to the signature line. Instead, I let out a shaky breath, slowly pulling my hand back and placing the pen gently down on the polished mahogany table. I looked up at Terence, widening my eyes to project the perfect image of a confused, anxiety-ridden woman. I told him that something simply did not make sense. I kept my voice trembling, pushing the performance to the exact limit. I explained that as a financial data analyst, I dealt with corporate deficits and complex tax structures every single day. I stated clearly that the Internal Revenue Service does not simply levy a $2 million penalty out of nowhere without issuing a formal documented audit notice. I asked Terence to show me the official federal letters. I asked to see the ledger. I told him that before I signed away my entire legal right to the estate, I needed to review the exact breakdown of my grandfather's supposed debt. It was a perfectly reasonable request from a financial professional, but to a cornered criminal, it was an absolute declaration of war. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The delicate, sorrowful facade my mother had been wearing completely shattered in a fraction of a second. Patricia slammed her manicured hands down flat against the heavy dining table. The massive impact rattled the crystal champagne flutes and made the expensive silverware clatter sharply. The sound was captured with crystal clarity by the federal transmitter hidden beneath my collar. She leaned forward, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered venom. Her eyes darted with a frantic, desperate rage that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the sheer terror of being caught. She screamed that I was always so incredibly selfish and utterly stupid. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, stripping away any lingering pretense of maternal affection. She pointed a sharp, trembling finger directly at my face, shouting that Terrence was trying to save this entire house from utter financial ruin. She aggressively defended his fabricated honor, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. She yelled that Terrence makes millions of dollars every single year and asked if I genuinely thought a man of his elite stature cared about my grandfather's ragged, worthless pennies. She demanded to know how I could be so deeply ungrateful when a highly successful investment broker was generously offering to clean up the disgraceful mess my grandfather had left behind. She told me I was an embarrassment to the family name, a paranoid, pathetic woman who always looked for a conspiracy instead of accepting the incredible charity she was being offered. She hammered every single insecurity she had ever planted in my head, using years of psychological manipulation to force me back into submission. She wanted to break my spirit right there in the dining room, ensuring I would blindly sign the waiver out of sheer panic and obedience. I kept my posture rigid, shrinking back slightly into the wooden chair as if her verbal assault was physically striking me. But inside, my heart beat with a steady, triumphant rhythm. I had just recorded my mother aggressively covering up a massive financial felony while simultaneously admitting that Terrence possessed millions in untraceable income. Brittany, however, was not finished. My younger sister had been sitting silently nursing her vintage champagne, but my hesitation had deeply offended her massive sense of entitlement. She relied entirely on Terrence's stolen money to fund her lavish, superficial lifestyle. My demand for transparency threatened her brand new Porsche, her designer wardrobe, and her entire false identity. Brittany abruptly stood up from her velvet chair. She grabbed her crystal water goblet from the table, her knuckles white with fury. Without a single word of warning, she hurled the entire glass of ice-cold water directly at me. The freezing liquid splashed violently across my face, soaking my hair and drenching the front of my outdated black dress. The heavy ice cubes hit my chest and clattered loudly onto the floor. I gasped, legitimately, shocked by the sudden physical assault, though I quickly lowered my chin to protect the micro-transmitter hidden beneath my collar. Brittany leaned over the table, her perfectly made-up face contorted with ugly, vicious rage. She screamed that if I did not pick up that pen and sign the document right this second, I needed to get the hell out of this family forever. The icy water dripped down my chin and soaked deeply into the heavy fabric of my collar. I did not reach up to wipe my face. I did not jump out of my chair or yell back at them. I just sat there letting the freezing water run down my neck, absorbing the absolute reality of my biological family. My mother was panting heavily, her chest heaving with rage. Terrence stood with his arms crossed, a dark, threatening shadow looming over the table, perfectly content to let his wife and mother-in-law terrorize me into submission. They had drawn their ultimate line in the sand. They were offering me a choice between blind obedience to a criminal syndicate or total permanent exile from their bloodline. They thought the threat of being disowned would crush me. They thought throwing water in my face would finally break my resolve and force me to surrender. I slowly reached out my wet, trembling hand and picked up the heavy gold pen once again. The freezing water dripped from my eyelashes and soaked deeply into the cheap fabric of my collar. I did not wipe my face. I let the heavy drops fall onto the polished mahogany table, each tiny splash sounding like a gavel strike in the dead silence of the dining room. Ice cubes scattered across the floor near my sensible work shoes melting slowly into the expensive Persian rug. Brittany stood over me, the empty crystal goblet still clutched tightly in her manicured hand. Her chest heaved with the exertion of her sudden violent outburst. She did not look apologetic or shocked by her own behavior. She looked entirely triumphant, like a spoiled child who had finally crushed a toy she had always despised. "Sign the paper right now!" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceiling. "If you do not sign it this exact second, you can get out of this family forever. We are entirely sick of your depressing attitude and your constant need to play the ultimate victim." I slowly turned my gaze to our mother. A normal parent would have intervened immediately. A normal mother would have reprimanded her youngest daughter for physically assaulting her oldest child without provocation. But Patricia did not even blink at the shattered ice on the floor. Instead, she slammed her own palms flat against the dining table, leaning in so close I could smell the sharp, expensive scent of her designer perfume mixed with the sour tang of vintage wine. "You are always so unbelievably selfish and stupid," Patricia hissed, her face contorted into a mask of pure venom. She pointed a trembling diamond-clad finger directly at my wet face. "Terrence is saving this entire house from utter destruction. He is stepping up to fix a massive disaster that would leave us all on the street, and you have the audacity to sit there and question his transparency." I kept my shoulders hunched, making myself look as small and intimidated as possible. I let my hand shake visibly as it hovered over the heavy gold pen. I needed them to keep talking. I needed the federal transmitter hidden beneath my soaked collar to capture every single arrogant admission of their financial superiority and aggressive coercion. "I just want to understand the tax debt," I whispered, forcing my voice to sound entirely broken and terrified. "I just want to know why the government is demanding $2 million from grandfather out of nowhere." Patricia slammed the table again, the impact rattling the heavy silverware. "You do not need to understand anything," she barked. "Terrence makes millions of dollars every single year. Do you honestly think a man of his elite status and incredible wealth craves your grandfather's torn, worthless pennies? He is doing you a massive favor. He is taking on a federal liability that would instantly bankrupt your pathetic little data analyst salary and ruin your entire life." Terrence stood in the background, leaning casually against the custom wet bar. He crossed his muscular arms over his chest, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle unfolding in front of him. He let out a low, mocking chuckle, entirely pleased that his wife and mother-in-law were doing his dirty work. He was a coward hiding behind the aggression of two greedy women, but his arrogant silence was just as incriminating as their screaming. Brittany slammed her empty glass down onto the table. "It is always the exact same story with you, Valerie. You have to ruin everything. Terrence bought me a brand new Porsche last week because he is highly successful and you simply cannot stand it. You cannot stand that my husband is a brilliant investment broker while you are just a lonely, bitter woman living in a cheap apartment struggling to pay off basic student loans. He is trying to protect the family name from the IRS, and you are interrogating him like a common criminal. Sign the damn paper and get out of our sight." I looked down at the waiver of inheritance. The bold black text swam slightly before my eyes, distorted by the cold water dripping from my hair. They had laid out their ultimatum perfectly. They had explicitly threatened to disown me if I did not sign a legal document under extreme emotional duress. They had verbally confirmed Terrence's massive undocumented offshore wealth on a live federal wire. They had painted themselves as the absolute saviors of a bankrupt estate, a lie so massive that the FBI agents in the surveillance van outside were probably struggling to contain their absolute shock. Patricia took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "Listen to me very carefully, Valerie. If you walk out that door without signing this document, you are dead to me. You will never set foot in this house again. You will not attend your grandfather's burial service tomorrow. You will be completely erased from this family. But if you pick up that pen and sign your name, Terrence will write a check to the federal government tomorrow morning, and you will walk away free and clear. Make your choice." I let out a ragged, trembling breath. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy gold pen. The cold metal felt slick against my wet fingers. I kept my head bowed, hiding the cold, calculating smile that threatened to break across my face. I had given them every opportunity to show a single ounce of humanity. I had offered them a chance to step back from the edge of their own destruction. Instead, they had chosen to double down on their cruelty, their boundless greed, and their massive financial fraud. They wanted me out of the family forever. They wanted to erase me from their perfect wealthy narrative. They had absolutely no idea that I was about to grant their wish in the most spectacular, devastating way imaginable. I positioned the tip of the gold pen directly above the signature line on the final page of the waiver. Terrence finally stepped away from the wet bar, moving closer to the table, like a predator moving in for the final kill. He wanted to watch me surrender. He wanted to see his ultimate victory secured in ink. I pressed the pen against the thick paper, ready to deliver the final lethal maneuver. The tip of the heavy gold pen hovered exactly 1 millimeter above the signature line. I let my hand shake violently, causing the dark ink to cast a tiny, trembling shadow against the pristine white paper. I drew in a ragged, uneven breath, ensuring the federal microphone hidden beneath my soaked collar captured the absolute terror I was projecting to the room. Terrence stepped fully into my peripheral vision. I could hear the expensive fabric of his trousers rustling as he shifted his weight. He was practically salivating. He leaned over the polished mahogany table, crowding my physical space, using his towering size to intimidate me into finalizing the surrender. Patricia and Brittany held their collective breath. The entire extravagant dining room felt like a pressurized vacuum, waiting for the final snap of the trap. But the ink never touched the dotted line. I suddenly pulled my hand back, clutching the heavy pen tightly against my chest like a frightened, cornered animal. I looked up at Terrence with wide, watering eyes. I forced my voice to crack, pitching it an octave higher to sound incredibly small and desperate. I told him I was absolutely terrified of the federal government. I said I had heard horrific, life-ruining stories about the Internal Revenue Service going after innocent family members when massive tax debts were left unpaid. I stammered, telling him that my modest data analyst salary could never afford a defense attorney if the federal auditors decided to investigate me just for being a biological granddaughter of a bankrupt man. Terrence rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, theatrical sigh of absolute exasperation. He looked over at Patricia, shaking his head as if dealing with an unbearable, idiotic burden. He told me I was being entirely hysterical. He reiterated that his massive offshore capital would wipe the slate clean by tomorrow morning, and that I would never hear from a single federal agent for the rest of my life. I shook my head frantically. I told him I needed it in writing. I told him that if he was truly the financial savior of this family, and if he was truly taking over the entire estate, he needed to give me an absolute legally binding guarantee that I was safe from prosecution. Before any of them could object or pull the document away, I flipped the thick legal packet over to the blank addendum section on the very last page. I gripped the gold pen and began to write quickly, making my handwriting intentionally messy and frantic to match my panicked persona. I spoke the words aloud as I wrote them down, making sure the audio transmitter caught every single syllable for the agent sitting in the surveillance van outside. I stated that I would sign the waiver of inheritance immediately, but only on one strict condition. I wrote that Terrence explicitly agrees to absorb and assume all legal, civil, and criminal responsibility for any and all financial transactions, asset transfers, and medical power of attorney decisions made on behalf of William Caldwell over the past 5 years. I finished writing the single paragraph and pushed the document across the polished wood toward him. I looked up at him with the most pathetic, pleading expression I could possibly muster. I told him that since he was the brilliant investment broker making millions of dollars a year, and I was just an ignorant woman living in a cheap apartment, he was the only one equipped to handle the legal liability. I said that if he signed this one sentence proving he was taking the entire burden off my shoulders, I would sign away my entire inheritance right this second. Terrence stared down at the handwritten sentence. A slow, deeply arrogant smirk spread across his face. He looked at my dripping wet hair, my ruined thrift store dress, and my trembling hands. He saw a broken, paranoid woman who was practically begging to hand him the keys to a multi-million-dollar kingdom. He completely and utterly underestimated me. He disregarded my profession as a data analyst, assuming I lacked the intellectual capacity to understand the legal weight of what I had just drafted. To him, this addendum was just the meaningless, paranoid scribbling of a terrified spinster trying to protect her meager bank account. In his greedy, narcissistic mind, signing that sentence was the easiest compromise in the world. It was a meaningless piece of paper that would instantly legalize his hostile takeover, silence his annoying sister-in-law, and officially secure the $4.5 million he had already stolen from my grandfather. Terrence threw his head back and laughed loudly. He mocked my overwhelming paranoia, telling Brittany that her sister was officially losing her mind over a tax audit that did not even exist. He snatched the heavy gold pen right out of my hand. He did not consult a lawyer. He did not pause to consider the precise, calculated phrasing of the sentence I had written. His blinding greed and his massive ego completely overrode any basic sense of self-preservation. He leaned over the table, pressing the pen hard against the thick paper. With a swift, arrogant flourish, he signed his full legal name right beneath my handwritten addendum. He slid the document back across the table, tapping the signature line on the front page with a manicured fingernail. He commanded me to sign my name and get out of his house permanently. I did not hesitate this time. I flipped the document back to the front. My hand was no longer trembling. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with absolute mechanical precision. The trap was officially locked. Terrence had just willingly and legally claimed full criminal responsibility for every single fraudulent transfer, every offshore wire, every fake medical directive, and every stolen penny taken from my grandfather over the last 5 years. He had just signed his own federal prison sentence on a live wire. I stood up from the wooden chair. The freezing water was still soaking through my collar, pressing the microphone against my skin, but my posture completely changed. The hunched, terrified woman vanished instantly. I stood perfectly straight, looking down at Terrence, Brittany, and Patricia. I smoothed the front of my ruined dress. I offered them a cold, completely hollow smile. I thanked my brother-in-law for being so incredibly generous and absorbing all the liability. I told them I would see everyone at the official reading of the will on Friday. Before they could even process the sudden jarring shift in my demeanor, I turned my back and walked out of the extravagant dining room, leaving them alone with a signed confession they did not even realize they had just executed. Friday morning arrived with a biting chill that swept through the financial district of downtown Boston. I rode the high-speed elevator up to the 45th floor of one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in the city. The glass-enclosed conference room offered a panoramic, dizzying view of the skyline. It was a fittingly sterile and highly transparent arena for the absolute destruction that was about to unfold. I took a seat near the corner of the massive frosted glass table. I wore a simple, unbranded gray pantsuit and my standard sensible heels. I had absolutely no desire to dress up for my own victory. The heavy mahogany double doors swung open, and my biological family made their highly theatrical entrance. They did not merely walk into the room. They paraded into it, treating the law office like their own personal runway. The cloying, heavy scent of Patricia's designer perfume immediately suffocated the climate-controlled air. She was dressed in an immaculate charcoal couture suit, adorned with a string of authentic pearls that probably cost more than my entire college education. Brittany followed closely behind, carrying a limited-edition luxury handbag and wearing a pair of red-bottomed heels that clicked aggressively against the hardwood floor. Then came Terrence. He strolled into the esteemed law office, as if his name was already etched onto the building exterior in solid gold letters. He wore a bespoke navy blue pinstripe suit tailored so tightly it looked uncomfortable paired with a vibrant, arrogant silk tie. He completely bypassed the guest seating and took the high-backed leather executive chair directly at the head of the table. It was a blatant physical declaration of his assumed dominance. He leaned far back, crossed his legs ankle over knee, and casually pulled an unlit Cuban cigar from his breast pocket. He did not light it, knowing the strict building regulations, but he rolled the expensive tobacco between his fingers, flashing his heavy gold Rolex with every single movement. He was the flawless picture of a man who believed he had just successfully pulled off the ultimate financial heist. Patricia took the seat next to him, elegantly crossing her legs. She looked across the expansive table and let her eyes scan my off-the-rack gray suit. A small, sharply condescending sigh escaped her lips. She leaned over to Brittany, whispering loudly enough for the acoustics of the glassroom to carry every single syllable directly to my ears. Patricia remarked that it was a profound embarrassment that I could not even muster the basic human decency to purchase a respectable outfit for the final reading of my grandfather's will. She said I looked like a mid-level secretary who had accidentally wandered onto the executive floor. Brittany laughed, a sharp grating sound that vibrated against the glass walls. She placed her expensive handbag prominently on the table as a physical barrier between us. She told our mother not to be too harsh. Brittany loudly claimed that since I had signed away my entire inheritance on Tuesday night, my pathetic data analyst's salary would barely cover my rent, let alone a trip to a luxury boutique. Brittany looked me dead in the eye, her lips curled into a vicious, triumphant smirk. She suggested that after Terrence officially liquidated the estate today and secured their multi-million-dollar payout, she might generously donate some of her last season clothes to my apartment so I would not look like a complete beggar at future family holidays. She added a cruel laugh, noting that this was assuming I was ever invited back to their mansion. Terrence tapped the unlit cigar against the glass table, drawing the attention back to his self-appointed throne. He let out a deep, arrogant chuckle. He told Brittany to leave me alone, his voice dripping with fake masculine pity. He declared that I had actually done the smartest thing in my entire miserable life by signing that waiver of inheritance. He bragged openly to the empty room, stating that dealing with the federal tax authorities and liquidating the old man's massive corporate liabilities required a true financial mastermind. He leaned forward, pointing the cigar at me, and said I should be getting down on my knees to thank him for shielding me from the catastrophic debt my grandfather had recklessly accumulated. They were entirely certain they were about to inherit the keys to the kingdom. They believed the waiver I had signed under the threat of exile was their impenetrable shield. They thought my grandfather's estate was nothing but an empty, hollow shell that Terrence was going to miraculously revive and transfer straight into his own offshore shell companies. They sat there basking in their own manufactured glory, trading smug glances, and calculating exactly how fast they could spend money that did not belong to them. I did not defend my gray pantsuit. I did not react to Brittany's shallow insults. I did not flinch at Patricia's absolute lack of maternal warmth. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the cold glass table. I looked at Terrence, staring directly at the heavy gold pen peeking out of his breast pocket, the exact same pen he had used to sign his full legal name to my handwritten addendum. I offered him a tight, polite smile. I told him I was incredibly eager to see exactly how the legal system would handle my grandfather's legacy today. I told him his financial expertise was going to be absolutely unforgettable. Terrence grinned broadly, completely missing the lethal double meaning of my words. He leaned back in his leather chair, supremely confident that he had won the war. He checked his gold watch, annoyed that the lawyer was keeping a man of his elite stature waiting. He had absolutely no idea the executioner was already in the building, and the blade was hovering right above his neck. The heavy mahogany doors of the conference room swung open once more, breaking the suffocating tension that had settled over the glass-enclosed space. Mr. Montgomery, a senior partner at the firm with decades of probate experience, walked in with slow, deliberate steps. He was a man in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase. He completely ignored Terrence's arrogant posture and Patricia's impatient sighs. He took his place at the opposite end of the massive glass table directly facing the skyline of Boston. He unclasped his briefcase with a sharp metallic snap that echoed loudly in the quiet room. Terrence leaned forward, tapping his unlit cigar impatiently against the table. He told the attorney to speed up the formalities so he could get back to his brokerage firm and begin liquidating the old man's mess. He confidently stated that they already knew the estate was completely underwater and that he was graciously stepping in to handle the massive federal tax liabilities. Mr. Montgomery did not even look up from his paperwork. He simply pushed his wire-rimmed glasses higher up the bridge of his nose and pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with thick red wax. Mr. Montgomery stated that he had received a direct, highly secure courier delivery late yesterday afternoon from Richard Cole, the branch manager at Bank of America. The mention of the bank manager's name caused a microscopic twitch in Terrence's jaw, but his massive ego prevented him from realizing the absolute danger he was in. Mr. Montgomery explained that William Caldwell had updated his final will and testament exactly 1 week before his passing, depositing it in a biometric subterranean vault that could only be accessed upon his verified death. Patricia let out a loud, highly dramatic scoff. She waved her diamond-clad hand in the air and declared that her father had been severely suffering from advanced dementia for the past 5 years. She confidently told the attorney that any document signed recently was completely legally void and that Terrence held the absolute medical and financial power of attorney over all assets. Mr. Montgomery finally looked up, his eyes cold and devoid of any sympathy. He flatly informed my mother that the document in his hands was accompanied by sworn notarized affidavits from 3 independent board-certified neurologists and a federal judge. They all legally certified that William Caldwell was in absolute perfect possession of his mental faculties up until his final breath. The room suddenly grew incredibly cold. The smug, self-satisfied smirk on Brittany's face began to falter, replaced by a shadow of genuine confusion. Mr. Montgomery slid a silver letter opener under the flap of the envelope and sliced through the red wax seal. The tearing of the thick paper sounded like a gunshot. He pulled out the crisp legal document, adjusted his glasses, and began to read the final declarations of my grandfather. He started with the revocations. Mr. Montgomery read aloud that William Caldwell explicitly, entirely, and permanently revoked any and all previous wills, codicils, and estate planning documents. Furthermore, the document stated that the medical and financial power of attorney previously granted to Terrence was immediately terminated and retroactively flagged for massive financial auditing. Terrence dropped his unlit cigar. It hit the glass table with a dull thud, rolling away until it hit Brittany's expensive handbag. He sat up straight, his broad shoulders suddenly rigid. He demanded to know what the attorney meant by auditing, his deep voice losing its arrogant smoothness. Mr. Montgomery ignored the outburst entirely and continued reading the precise, lethal legal language my grandfather had meticulously drafted. The attorney moved to the distribution of assets. He read that William Caldwell was fully aware of the true nature, character, and actions of his biological daughter, Patricia, and his youngest granddaughter, Brittany. Mr. Montgomery's voice was steady and unforgiving as he read the exact stipulations. Patricia and Brittany were to receive absolutely nothing. The document explicitly stated they were to be given exactly $0, 0 real estate properties, 0 personal items, and 0 access to any corporate dividends. They were entirely and permanently disinherited from the Caldwell estate. Patricia physically recoiled, as if she had been struck across the face. Her hand flew up to clutch her expensive pearl necklace, her manicured fingers trembling violently. She gasped for air, her eyes wide with sheer, unfiltered panic. She looked at Terrence, expecting him to fix this massive disruption to their wealthy narrative. Brittany let out a shrill, high-pitched gasp of outrage. She slammed her hands on the glass table, shouting that this was completely impossible and that the lawyer was reading a fraudulent document. She shrieked about her lifestyle, her credit card bills, and the brand-new Porsche parked outside, demanding her rightful share of the money. Mr. Montgomery did not pause for their theatrics. He raised his voice slightly to cut through Brittany's hysterical screaming. He reached the final and most important clause of the legal document. He announced that 100% of the William Caldwell estate was to be immediately and irrevocably transferred to his eldest granddaughter, Valerie. The attorney listed the assets one by one, letting the massive reality of my new wealth crush the people sitting across from me. I was now the sole undisputed owner of the multi-million-dollar logistics company. I was the sole owner of the sprawling suburban mansion Patricia currently lived in. I was the sole beneficiary of the offshore investment accounts, the commercial real estate portfolio, and the massive untouched trust fund that had been quietly accumulating interest for decades. Every single penny, every single property, and every single ounce of corporate power now belonged entirely to me. The silence that followed the reading was deafening. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total annihilation. I sat perfectly still in my simple gray pantsuit, my hands still folded neatly on the cold glass table. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked directly at Patricia, watching her perfectly constructed wealthy elite identity shatter into a million irreparable pieces. Patricia stared back at me, her face a sickly shade of gray, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Brittany was hyperventilating, clutching her designer handbag against her chest, as if it could protect her from the sudden terrifying reality of absolute poverty. Terrence sat frozen in his high-backed leather executive chair. The man who had walked into the room believing he was an untouchable financial mastermind now looked like a trapped, panicked animal. He realized in that exact moment that he had no legal power, no access to the funds he desperately needed to cover his tracks, and absolutely no control over the woman sitting across from him. The entire empire they thought they had stolen had just been handed directly to the one person they had spent their entire lives trying to destroy. The heavy silence in the glass-enclosed conference room shattered violently. Terrence broke out of his temporary paralysis. The sheer, terrifying realization that he had just lost his entire illegal fortune sent a violent shockwave through his massive frame. He kicked himself backward, pushing the heavy leather executive chair away with such explosive force that it crashed loudly against the frosted glass wall behind him. The impact shook the room. Terrence slammed both of his large fists down onto the thick glass table. The heavy crystal water pitchers rattled dangerously. He leaned entirely across the table, the veins in his neck bulging against the tight collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. He roared that the document Mr. Montgomery had just read was nothing but absolute garbage. His deep voice boomed, completely stripping away his polished upper-class investment broker persona. He screamed that I was a manipulative, calculating liar. He accused me of sneaking into the high-security care facility, isolating a severely mentally compromised old man, and aggressively forcing him to sign a fraudulent document to steal the family wealth. Patricia and Brittany immediately rallied behind his explosive outburst. They gasped in synchronized theatrical horror, nodding along with his baseless accusations. They desperately needed his narrative to be true. They needed me to be the criminal so their wealthy, elite lifestyle could remain intact. But Terrence was not finished. A wicked, triumphant sneer suddenly broke across his sweating face. He stood up straight, puffing out his chest, completely convinced he held the ultimate trump card. He reached his large hand into the inner pocket of his bespoke navy blue suit jacket. He aggressively pulled out the thick, professionally bound legal packet from our Tuesday night dinner. He threw it down onto the center of the conference table, right on top of my grandfather's wax-sealed envelope. The heavy paper landed with a loud, definitive smack. He looked at the senior attorney with absolute blinding arrogance. He declared that my pathetic little scheme was already dead on arrival. He proudly announced that he possessed a legally binding waiver of inheritance and full relinquishment of estate claims. He bragged loudly that I had willingly signed away every single asset, every property right, and every corporate title just 3 days ago. He looked over at his wife Brittany, giving her a smug, victorious wink. He told the room that he was still the sole legal authority over the estate, and that my delusional attempt at a hostile takeover was officially terminated. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single word of defense. I simply sat in my gray pantsuit, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and watched a profoundly arrogant man proudly display the exact instrument of his own total destruction. Mr. Montgomery did not look surprised. He did not look intimidated by the towering, screaming man standing across from him. The seasoned attorney slowly reached out and picked up the waiver. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, scanning the front page with an expression of mild clinical amusement. The contrast between Terrence's unhinged screaming and the lawyer's absolute icy composure was striking. Mr. Montgomery looked back up at Terrence. He placed the document back onto the glass table and delivered the first crushing blow. He stated in a flat, monotone voice that this specific waiver was completely null and void. He explained the uncompromising reality of probate law. William Caldwell officially updated, locked, and registered his final, irrevocable trust with the federal banking system exactly 7 days ago. Mr. Montgomery explained that any waiver signed by a beneficiary after that specific federal registry date held absolutely zero legal weight. He noted that a relinquishment document drafted without independent legal counsel and signed under undocumented, highly suspicious circumstances in a private residence would be instantly thrown out by any probate judge in the country. Terrence's triumphant grin instantly vanished. The color began to drain from his face as the legal reality of the situation crashed down upon him, but the senior partner was not done. The execution had only just begun. Mr. Montgomery slowly flipped the thick legal packet over to the very last page. He smoothed out the paper, his eyes landing directly on the messy, frantic paragraph I had handwritten at the bottom of the addendum section. He looked at the bold, arrogant signature Terrence had placed right beneath it. The lawyer looked at Terrence, a razor-sharp, terrifyingly cold smile appearing on his face. He told the investment broker that the invalidity of the waiver was actually the least of his problems today. He stated that while the relinquishment of assets was legally void, the handwritten addendum attached to the back was a completely different matter. He explained that by signing his full legal name to that specific clause, Terrence had executed a binding voluntary assumption of liability. Mr. Montgomery read my handwritten paragraph aloud. His voice carried through the quiet room, enunciating every single highly calculated word I had drafted. He read that Terrence explicitly agreed to absorb and assume all legal, civil, and criminal responsibility for any and all financial transactions, asset transfers, and medical power of attorney decisions made on behalf of William Caldwell over the past 5 years. Terrence stopped breathing. His hands began to shake visibly. Patricia let out a soft, terrified whimper, her manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth. Mr. Montgomery reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a secondary heavy file. He slid a summarized financial audit across the glass table directly toward Terrence. The lawyer explained that the bank and the estate auditors had already completed a preliminary review of the accounts previously managed under the now terminated medical power of attorney. He stated that exactly $4.5 million had been systematically drained from William Caldwell's corporate retirement accounts. He noted that the funds were meticulously funneled into offshore shell entities tied directly to Terrence's primary brokerage firm. The attorney leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. He looked at the sweating, panicked man across the table and delivered the final lethal strike. He told Terrence that the addendum he signed on Tuesday night, officially and legally, transformed him from a suspected embezzler into a confessed criminal. By signing that paper to secure his fraudulent takeover, Terrence had formally taken sole documented ownership of the $4.5 million theft. He had voluntarily provided the exact written confession required to prosecute him for massive multi-million-dollar financial fraud. The trap had snapped shut, breaking his spine completely. The absolute silence that followed Mr. Montgomery's revelation was heavier than concrete. The glass-enclosed conference room, previously a stage for my family's supreme arrogance, had instantly transformed into a sterile execution chamber. The reality of the signed addendum hung in the air, a physical weight pressing down on the chests of the 3 people across from me. Terrence remained entirely paralyzed in the executive chair. The aggressive, towering investment broker had been reduced to a hollow, sweating shell. His mind, usually so adept at spinning financial lies, was completely short-circuiting as he calculated the sheer length of the federal prison sentence he had just willingly signed up for. But while Terence was frozen in a state of terminal shock, the survival instincts of my mother violently kicked in. Patricia stared at the legal documents resting on the glass table. Her eyes darted wildly between the forged waiver Terence had proudly displayed and the heavily audited financial summary provided by the estate. The horrific mathematical equation finally solved itself in her mind. She realized that the impenetrable legal shield they thought they possessed was completely gone. The $4.5 million she had helped steal the offshore accounts she had benefited from the luxury lifestyle she had meticulously cultivated. All of it was evaporating right before her eyes. Worse than the loss of the money was the impending unavoidable public exposure. The high society friends, the country club elites, the local politicians she spent her life impressing would soon see her not as a wealthy matriarch, but as a convicted felon. All the color drained entirely from Patricia's face. The thick layer of expensive foundation and perfectly applied blush could not hide the sickening ashen gray tone of absolute terror creeping across her skin. Her perfectly curated elite posture completely collapsed. She let out a sharp, ragged gasp, a sound of pure panic that clawed its way out of her throat. She abruptly shoved her heavy leather chair backward. The legs scraped harshly against the polished hardwood floor, the sound piercing the dead silence of the room. Patricia scrambled to her feet, abandoning every single ounce of her aristocratic dignity. She practically lunged across the corner of the massive glass table. Her designer suit wrinkled, and her expensive pearl necklace swung wildly against her chest. She reached out with both hands, her manicured fingers trembling violently, and aggressively grabbed my right hand where it rested on the table. Her grip was painfully tight, fueled by sheer unfiltered desperation. Her palms were clammy slick with cold sweat. I looked down at her hands, clutching mine, feeling absolutely nothing but a deep clinical detachment. "Valerie, please," Patricia begged. Her voice cracked, shattering into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. She dropped to her knees right there on the polished hardwood floor, ignoring the presence of the senior attorney entirely. Her perfectly styled hair fell into her face, and her eyes were wide, brimming with frantic, genuine tears. "Daughter, you cannot do this to me," she pleaded, her voice echoing shrilly off the frosted glass walls. "You cannot do this to your sister. Look at Brittany. She is your family. We are your family. We are your own flesh and blood. You have to tell the lawyer to destroy those papers. You have to tell the bank to stop the audit. If you let this go forward, Terrence's entire career will be ruined. His brokerage firm will be destroyed. He will go to prison, and Brittany will have absolutely nothing. We will lose the mansion. We will lose everything. You cannot destroy your own family over a misunderstanding." She squeezed my hand tighter, her tears dripping down onto my sensible gray pantsuit. She was trying to deploy the exact same psychological manipulation she had used to control me for 33 years. She was using the heavy guilt-laden concept of family loyalty as a weapon to shield herself from federal prosecution. She expected me to fold. She expected the quiet, insecure daughter to suddenly feel an overwhelming surge of filial duty and sacrifice my own future to save them from the consequences of their massive greed. I stared down at the woman kneeling on the floor. I processed the data of her tears, her shaking voice, and her desperate invocation of our biological connection. For decades I had craved her approval. For decades I had allowed her to make me feel small, invisible, and entirely worthless. But looking at her now stripped of her arrogance and reduced to a begging criminal, I felt an overwhelming wave of absolute chilling liberation. I did not soften my expression. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I deliberately and forcefully yanked my hand out of her frantic grip. The sudden violent rejection threw her off balance. Patricia stumbled backward slightly, her hands hitting the cold glass of the table as she looked up at me in sheer shock. "Flesh and blood," I repeated. My voice was perfectly level, devoid of any anger or sorrow. It was the cold mechanical tone of a data analyst delivering a final undeniable conclusion. The words sliced through the air with lethal precision. I stood up slowly from my chair, towering over my mother where she knelt on the floor. I looked directly into her terrified eyes. Is it flesh and blood when you help this arrogant son-in-law launder your own father's blood, sweat, and tears through offshore shell companies? I asked, my voice ringing out clearly across the room. Is it flesh and blood when you spend years cashing illicit checks to buy designer clothes and country club memberships while you lock your own father away in a facility pretending he has lost his mind? Patricia opened her mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic fabricated excuse, but I did not give her the chance to breathe. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to hers, ensuring she heard every single syllable of her own execution. Or maybe you define flesh and blood by what happened on Tuesday morning. I continued, my gaze locking onto hers with unwavering intensity. I watched the exact moment her heart stopped beating. Is it flesh and blood when you deliberately instruct a private nurse to cut off his essential heart medication? Is it family loyalty when you replace his life-saving pills with useless placebos just so his heart would give out faster? You murdered him, Patricia. You murdered your own father to expedite your multi-million-dollar payout before the auditors could catch your precious son-in-law draining the retirement accounts. The entire room plunged into an abyss of absolute horrifying silence. Mr. Montgomery remained perfectly still, his hands resting on the legal documents, his face a mask of professional stoicism. He already knew the contents of the federal investigation. Brittany let out a choked, suffocated gasp. She pressed her hands over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically between me and our mother. Brittany was incredibly greedy and highly superficial, but the sheer violent reality of premeditated murder was entirely beyond her comprehension. She stared at Patricia as if she were looking at a complete stranger, a monster hiding behind expensive makeup and pearls. Terrence finally moved. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a new, infinitely more dangerous level of terror. He had believed they were only facing financial fraud charges. He believed his sophisticated money laundering was the worst of their problems. He stared at Patricia, realizing in real time that his mother-in-law had escalated their white-collar crime into a federal homicide investigation, and he was completely legally tethered to her actions by the very document he had signed on Tuesday night. Patricia remained frozen on the hardwood floor. The denial she had meticulously built over the past 48 hours was completely incinerated. She realized I knew everything. I knew about the offshore routing numbers. I knew about the fraudulent medical directives. I knew about the toxicology report. There was no lie left to tell. There was no emotional manipulation left to deploy. She was staring directly at her own life sentence delivered by the daughter she had deemed completely worthless. I stood back up, adjusting the cuffs of my gray suit. I looked down at the shattered, ruined remnants of my biological family. The financial and emotional audit was officially complete, and the final penalty was about to be collected. The suffocating silence that trapped the conference room was abruptly and violently shattered. The heavy mahogany double doors at the entrance of the suite did not simply open. They were thrust apart with bone-rattling force. The thick brass handles slammed aggressively against the frosted glass walls, sending a sharp, terrifying echo bouncing across the polished hardwood floor. The pristine, highly insulated world of corporate law was instantly invaded by the harsh, uncompromising reality of federal law enforcement. Special Agent Ramirez strode through the threshold. He was no longer the quiet, calculating investigator I had spoken with inside the subterranean bank vault. He was now the absolute embodiment of federal authority. His posture was rigid, his expression set in stone, and his dark eyes swept across the room with lethal precision. Directly behind him, a heavily armed tactical team of 6 FBI agents poured into the executive space. They moved with terrifying coordinated speed. The bright, stark yellow letters spelling out FBI across the backs of their dark navy windbreakers clashed violently with the refined high society aesthetic of the law firm. Their heavy tactical boots trampled over the expensive rugs, completely disregarding the elite atmosphere my family valued above all else. The agents immediately fanned out, securing the perimeter of the room. Two agents moved swiftly to flank the exit, blocking any possible road of escape. Another agent marched directly toward the massive glass table, placing a heavy hand flat over the forged legal documents and the fraudulent waiver Terrence had proudly displayed just minutes ago. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the federal government sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the room. Agent Ramirez stepped forward, positioning himself directly at the head of the table. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his gold federal badge, holding it up so the polished metal caught the glare of the overhead lights. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The absolute cold authority in his tone commanded complete submission. "Terrence Vance," Agent Ramirez announced, his voice cutting through the room like a steel blade. "You are under arrest by order of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Terrence remained frozen in his high-backed leather chair. His massive shoulders slumped forward, and the arrogant, untouchable investment broker persona completely evaporated. He stared at the federal agent with wide, unblinking eyes, his mouth hanging slightly open as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. Agent Ramirez did not pause to let the shock settle. He began reading the official federal charges, delivering each felony as a distinct physical blow. "You are being charged with multiple counts of first-degree wire fraud, systemic money laundering across international borders, and aggravated elder financial abuse. We have successfully secured the offshore routing numbers tied to your brokerage firm and frozen all shell accounts registered in the Cayman Islands." Terrence let out a shallow, ragged gasp. His heavy gold Rolex caught the light as his hands began to shake uncontrollably against the armrests of his chair. The $4.5 million he had stolen, the money he believed was safely hidden away in untraceable accounts, had already been seized by the United States government. His entire financial empire was nothing but a pile of ashes. Agent Ramirez then turned his hardened gaze toward the floor, looking directly down at my mother. Patricia was still kneeling on the hardwood, her expensive couture suit wrinkled, her face stained with ruined makeup and frantic tears. The federal agent looked at her with an expression of profound, unfiltered disgust. "Patricia Caldwell." Agent Ramirez continued, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. "You are also under arrest. You are being charged as a primary accessory to grand financial theft, systemic medical fraud, and conspiracy to commit voluntary manslaughter." The word manslaughter hit the room with the force of an exploding bomb. Brittany let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, throwing her hands over her ears, as if trying to physically block out the sound of the federal charges. Patricia collapsed completely, her upper body slumping forward until her forehead nearly rested against the cold floor. She let out a guttural, animalistic wail of pure terror. The elegant country club matriarch, who had spent her entire life obsessing over her public image, was now crying on the floor of a law firm publicly branded as a murderer. Agent Ramirez gestured sharply to his tactical team. Two agents stepped forward immediately. They bypassed the formalities of asking the suspects to stand. One agent grabbed Terrence by the bicep, hauling his massive frame out of the executive chair with forceful, uncompromising efficiency. The expensive fabric of Terrence's bespoke navy blue suit pulled tightly across his back as the agent forcibly twisted his arms behind him. The sharp metallic clicking sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Terrence's wrists echoed loudly through the glass room. That singular sound, the cold snap of locking metal, was the exact moment the polished upper-class illusion completely shattered. The wealthy investment broker was officially dead. The cornered, desperate federal criminal was born. The instant the cold steel bit into his skin, Terrence lost his mind entirely. Total, blinding panic overtook his senses. He thrashed his shoulders against the grip of the federal agents, his face turning a deep, violently angry shade of crimson. He realized with absolute certainty that he was staring down the barrel of a 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His survival instincts kicked in, overriding any shred of family loyalty or basic human decency. It was her! Terrence roared, his deep voice cracking with pure desperation. He violently jerked his head, pointing his chin down at Patricia, where she was being hauled to her feet by another pair of agents. He screamed that he was completely innocent. He shouted that Patricia was a psychotic, manipulative mastermind who orchestrated the entire financial heist. She is the one who gave me the account passwords, Terrence bellowed, sweat pouring down his forehead and soaking into his crisp white designer collar. She came to my office crying about bankruptcy. She handed me the medical proxy documents. She is the one who bribed the private nurses at the hospice facility to look the other way. I just moved the money because she begged me to save the family estate. I did not kill anyone. She cut off the old man's heart medication. She wanted him dead so she could cash out before the annual corporate audit. She planned the whole thing. Patricia, whose wrists were currently being secured in her own pair of steel handcuffs, whipped her head around. Her eyes widened with absolute feral fury. The woman who had proudly defended her son-in-law just 30 minutes ago now looked at him with murderous intent. The alliance forged in greed instantly dissolved into a vicious mutual slaughter. "You lying parasitic coward!" Patricia shrieked, her voice scratching her throat as she struggled against the federal agents holding her arms. She spat the words out with toxic venom, completely unhinged by his rapid betrayal. She screamed that Terrence was a pathetic con artist who preyed on a vulnerable, grieving family. She yelled that he had aggressively brainwashed her, promising to double her inheritance if she just signed a few medical release forms. "He forced me to do it," Patricia wailed, looking frantically toward Agent Ramirez, desperately trying to sell herself as the ultimate victim. "He told me my father was going to die anyway. He said the logistics company was failing, and we needed to secure the cash offshore to protect our assets. He is the one who set up the shell companies. He is the one who bought the sports cars and the luxury watches with my father's blood money. He manipulated all of us. He is a monster." "You greedy, superficial witch," Terrence fired back, the veins in his neck straining against his skin as he bared his teeth at his own mother-in-law. "You spent $500,000 of that stolen cash on your private country club dues and your European vacations in the first 3 months. You loved the money. You told me to keep draining the accounts so you could buy your stupid designer jewelry. You are a cold-blooded killer who traded her own father's life for a diamond necklace. Do not stand there and act like a victim when you handed me the murder weapon." The two co-conspirators viciously tore each other to pieces right there in the center of the elegant conference room. They screamed profanities, hurling highly specific, deeply incriminating details of their own crimes at each other in a desperate, pathetic attempt to secure a plea deal from the FBI. They willingly confessed to wire fraud, bribery, and premeditated manslaughter just to ensure the other person went down with them. The refined, elite family dynamic they had violently protected their entire lives was currently bleeding out on the hardwood floor, exposed as nothing but a den of backstabbing thieves. Brittany watched the horrific scene unfold from her chair, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. She watched her handsome, wealthy husband and her perfectly polished mother scream like cornered rats, completely destroying each other in front of federal law enforcement. The designer handbag resting on the table suddenly meant absolutely nothing. The brand new Porsche parked downstairs was officially federal evidence. Her entire identity, her entire existence built on unearned wealth and arrogant superiority was instantly vaporized. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob a loud, pathetic wailing that went completely ignored by everyone in the room. I stood perfectly still beside the glass table watching the chaotic, beautiful destruction of my abusers. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the need to intervene or gloat. The punishment was actively executing itself. I looked over at Mr. Montgomery, the senior attorney. He calmly adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, picked up the authentic wax-sealed will that granted me the entire Caldwell empire, and safely secured it inside his thick leather briefcase. He locked the brass clasps with a sharp, definitive click. The estate was completely secure, the criminals were in chains, the financial and emotional audit was officially over, and the ledger was finally balanced. The tactical team forcibly marched Terence and Patricia toward the heavy mahogany double doors. Their vicious, unhinged screaming matches faded into the corridor as the agents dragged them toward the service elevators. They left behind a profound ringing silence inside the glass-enclosed conference room. The chaotic storm of federal law enforcement had swept through and completely neutralized the primary threats. Mr. Montgomery quietly packed the last of his legal documents, offered me a respectful nod, and exited the room. He gave me the floor for the final reckoning. Only one parasite remained. Brittany was still slumped in her leather executive chair. The woman who had spent her entire adult life treating me like dirt beneath her expensive red-bottomed shoes was now hyperventilating. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled, chaotic mess. Black mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, completely ruining her flawless, aristocratic facade. She stared at the empty space where her wealthy husband and domineering mother had stood just minutes ago. The brutal reality of her new existence was violently crashing down on her. She had no trust fund. She had no offshore accounts. The brand new Porsche she had bragged about was already tagged as federal evidence. Her entire identity, built entirely on stolen money and unearned superiority, had just been legally and permanently vaporized. She slowly turned her head and looked at me. For the first time in 33 years, she did not look at me with disgust or condescension. She looked at me with absolute, unfiltered terror. I stood perfectly still in my simple gray pantsuit, looking down at her with a clinical, detached precision. Brittany slipped out of her chair. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, her expensive designer dress pooling around her knees. She did not try to stand back up. Instead, she began to crawl. She dragged herself across the floor, abandoning every single ounce of her country club dignity. She reached out with trembling manicured hands and desperately grabbed onto the fabric of my trousers. She wrapped her arms around my calves, burying her tear-stained face against my knees. She began to sob uncontrollably. It was a loud, pathetic, heaving sound. She begged me to help them. She pleaded with me to use my massive new inheritance to post federal bail for Terence and Patricia. She cried that Terence was not built for federal prison, that he would not survive behind bars, and that our mother would die if she was locked away in a concrete cell. Brittany choked on her own tears, desperately trying to invoke the sacred bond of sisterhood. She screamed that we were family. She wailed that we shared the same blood, and that sisters were supposed to protect each other no matter what. She promised she would do anything I wanted. She promised she would be a better sister, that she would respect me, that she would never insult my career or my clothes ever again. She begged me for a fraction of the millions I now controlled, just enough to hire a criminal defense attorney to save her luxurious life from total destruction. I looked down at the woman clinging to my legs. I felt no pity. I felt no sisterly affection. I felt nothing but the cold, calculating satisfaction of a data analyst who had successfully balanced a severely corrupted ledger. The math was finally resolving itself flawlessly. I did not try to kick her away immediately. I reached into the pocket of my gray blazer and slowly pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and opened my secure audio files. I tapped the screen, selecting the high-definition recording captured by the federal microtransmitter during our disastrous dinner just a few nights ago. I turned the volume all the way up and pressed play. The pristine acoustics of the glass conference room amplified the audio perfectly. Brittany's own shrill, vicious voice echoed off the walls. The recording captured the exact moment she had thrown the glass of freezing water in my face. The audio played her screaming that I was a depressing, miserable woman. It played her mocking my data analyst salary. And finally, it broadcast her ultimate threat loud and clear for both of us to hear. If you do not sign it this exact second, you can get out of this family forever. I hit pause. The harsh, cruel words hung in the heavy air, instantly silencing Brittany's pathetic sobbing. She froze, her hands still gripping my ankles as she listened to the undeniable proof of her own venomous nature. She looked up at me, her red, swollen eyes wide with horror as she realized that her own arrogance had permanently sealed her fate. There was no denying the recording, there was no gaslighting her way out of this room. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to hers. My voice was completely devoid of emotion, sharp and precise as a surgical scalpel. I told her that I was a woman of my word. I told her that I had listened to her ultimatum very carefully that night, and I had finally decided to take her highly aggressive advice. I forcefully pulled my leg back, breaking her desperate grip. Brittany slumped forward, her hands hitting the cold hardwood floor. She let out a soft, defeated whimper, completely stripped of any remaining leverage or hope. She was entirely broken, a hollow shell of the bully she used to be. "I am getting out," I said coldly, looking down at her ruined, tear-stained face. "Keep your convict husband." I did not wait for a response. I did not offer a single backward glance. I turned on my heel and walked with absolute unwavering purpose toward the heavy mahogany doors. My sensible work shoes clicked rhythmically against the floor, a steady beat of pure, unadulterated freedom. I pushed the doors open and stepped out of the conference room, leaving my toxic sister crying alone on the floor amidst the shattered remains of her stolen empire. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway of the prestigious law firm, stepping into the bright, sunlit lobby. The heavy, suffocating weight of my biological family was permanently lifted from my shoulders. I pressed the button for the elevator, ready to descend into the bustling streets of Boston. I was ready to take absolute control of my grandfather's legacy and my own brilliant, undisputed future. The execution was complete. 6 months later, the heavy wooden gavel of a federal judge slammed down, echoing with absolute, unforgiving finality across the courtroom. The swift and brutal machinery of the United States justice system had completely pulverized my biological family. There were no plea deals offered and no high-priced defense attorneys capable of fighting the mountain of forensic financial data and the crystal-clear audio recordings I had provided to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Terrence stood before the federal bench, entirely stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his heavy gold Rolex. He wore a standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit, his wrists chained securely to his waist. The arrogant, towering investment broker who had ruthlessly mocked my data analyst's salary was now nothing more than a federal inmate. The judge handed down a maximum sentence of 20 years in a high-security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, international money laundering, and the severe financial exploitation of a vulnerable elder. Terrence did not turn to look at the gallery. He simply stared at the floor. His broad shoulders slumped in total, irreversible defeat, knowing he would lose the prime decades of his life locked inside a concrete cage. Patricia fared no better. My mother, the woman who had spent her entire existence obsessing over country club membership's elite social status and maintaining a flawless aristocratic facade, completely shattered when her sentence was read. The judge showed zero leniency for a woman who had actively conspired to withhold life-saving medication from her own father out of sheer, unadulterated greed. She received a mandatory 15-year sentence in a federal women correctional facility. As the marshals escorted her out of the courtroom, she let out a hollow, agonizing wail. The heavy steel doors closed behind her, permanently shutting out the luxurious world she had committed murder to protect. The criminal convictions triggered an immediate and catastrophic financial avalanche. The Internal Revenue Service swept in with absolute ruthless efficiency to reclaim every single stolen penny and levy massive tax penalties. Federal agents arrived at the sprawling suburban mansion with official seizure notices. The pristine property my mother had fiercely guarded was locked down and auctioned off to the highest bidder to satisfy the massive federal debt. The gleaming silver Porsche that Terrence had purchased for Brittany was unceremoniously towed out of the circular driveway by government contractors. Every single offshore account, every hidden trust, and every piece of designer jewelry was aggressively liquidated to balance the federal ledger. Brittany was left with absolutely nothing. The spoiled, entitled younger sister who had confidently thrown a glass of ice water in my face and ordered me out of the family was now completely legally and financially radioactive. Her wealthy friends and the elite society she had desperately tried to impress treated her like a contagious disease. When her credit cards were declined and her bank accounts frozen, not a single person from her upper-class circle offered her a place to stay or a loan to survive. She was entirely boycotted, blacklisted from the only world she had ever known. Without a college degree, without any usable professional skills, and carrying the heavy, inescapable stigma of her husband's highly publicized federal crimes, Brittany was forced into the harsh, unforgiving reality of the working class she had always deeply despised. She currently works 40 hours a week as a cashier at a discount supermarket on the outskirts of the city. She spends her days standing under flickering fluorescent lights, wearing a cheap polyester uniform, scanning barcodes for minimum wage. Every time a wealthy customer walks past her register carrying a designer handbag, Brittany is forced to remember the empire she threw away because she chose cruelty and greed over her own sister. While their corrupt world burned to the ground, my ascent was quiet, calculated, and absolute. I did not return to the small, cramped apartment I had occupied for years. I relocated to New York City, taking my rightful place at the helm of the empire my grandfather had meticulously built. The elevator doors opened smoothly onto the 40th floor of a towering glass skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan. I stepped out into the expansive, sunlit reception area of the William Caldwell Investment Fund. I was no longer a struggling data analyst taking orders from mediocre managers. I was the sole executive officer and the undisputed majority shareholder of a multi-million-dollar financial institution. I wore a sharp, impeccably tailored black suit, my posture perfectly straight, my steps echoing with undeniable authority against the polished Italian marble floors. I walked past the team of financial analysts and portfolio managers I now employed, offering them a brief professional nod. I entered my private corner office. The space was massive, enclosed by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the New York City skyline. The chaotic, vibrant energy of the financial capital stretched out endlessly below me, but inside my office the atmosphere was a sanctuary of absolute calm and supreme control. I walked over to my expansive modern desk carved from solid obsidian. The desk was meticulously organized, completely free of clutter, reflecting the sharp analytical precision I applied to every aspect of my life and business. However, sitting directly in the center of the vast desk, placed prominently under the bright morning sunlight, was a single, highly unusual object. It was the worn, frayed leather passbook my grandfather had pressed into my hand during his final dying moments. It was no longer a discarded piece of garbage resting at the bottom of a funeral home trash bin. I had the small battered book professionally preserved and encased inside a thick, solid block of crystal clear acrylic. It rested on a polished brass stand, serving as a daily, tangible reminder of the exact moment I chose to stop being a victim and started becoming an executioner. It was the ultimate symbol of my grandfather's brilliant foresight and my own unyielding resilience. I walked behind the desk and picked up a ceramic mug of freshly brewed black coffee. I turned my back to the heavy wooden doors and faced the towering glass windows. The morning sun cast a warm golden glow over the dense concrete jungle of Manhattan. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark, bitter coffee, letting the rich taste ground me in the present moment. The financial audit was officially closed. The massive deficit of toxic family manipulation had been completely erased from my life. The parasites had been permanently eradicated, locked away in concrete cells, or trapped behind grocery store cash registers. The ledger was finally flawlessly balanced. I looked out over the sprawling city, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of absolute freedom. A slow, cold, and entirely satisfied smile spread across my face. I had not just survived the fire they tried to burn me in. I had used the flames to forge an empire. The screen slowly fades to black. The cleansing is officially complete. The most profound lesson from this journey is that true power rarely needs to announce itself. Arrogance is loud, but competence is silent. Terrence and Patricia built their entire identities on flashy displays of wealth and aggressive manipulation, mistaking Valerie's quiet endurance for weakness. However, in the real world, the person who observes, gathers data, and controls their emotions ultimately controls the battlefield. We are often conditioned to believe that blood relations demand our infinite patience and unconditional sacrifice. This story violently shatters that toxic myth. Being born into a family does not give them a lifelong license to exploit your empathy or destroy your future. Valerie teaches us that walking away from abusive relatives is not an act of betrayal. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and you absolutely cannot negotiate with parasites who view your compassion as an opportunity for theft. Finally, the narrative proves that your greatest setbacks can be weaponized into your greatest comebacks. When you stop seeking validation from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it you, free up massive amounts of energy to build your own empire. Justice is not always about dramatic screaming matches or lowering yourself to their level. Sometimes perfect justice is simply becoming undeniably successful and leaving your abusers to drown in the natural consequences of their own horrific choices. Your worth is never determined by those who failed to value you. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic environment to protect your own peace and build your own empire? Share your story in the comments below and make sure to hit that subscribe button for more empowering tales of resilience and absolute justice.